Hello everyone, this is Grant Friedman, editor of Psdtuts, and today I'm with Martin Perhiniak, Adobe Certified Expert and Instructor. Martin is the author of our Digital Art for Beginners series, as well as our Photoshop Basics series on Psdtuts. Martin, welcome to the show.
Hi everyone. Thank you, Grant.
Martin, I frequently introduce you as Adobe Certified Expert and Instructor. Can you tell us a little bit about exactly what that means? How does one become a certified expert, and how do you prepare, and why would somebody want to be certified?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really interesting question, and um, I usually start to introduce everyone to the whole certification with Adobe by telling them about the expert exam, which is not only for Photoshop, so it's for all the Adobe applications, but this whole exam system is something that you don't need to be. So if you want to be a good designer, you don't need to pass the exam. Basically, that's what I mean. But if you have the exam, it can help you a lot in your professional work, and it can help you to boost your CV and find jobs, not just as a Photoshop expert like a designer, but you can also become a presenter or an instructor if you feel like you're interested in training other people. So the way I started uh, when I started design, I always wanted to be as close as possible to the techniques and to the innovations in these products, like in Photoshop. So I thought that the best way to be there at the top is to pass this exam. And I'm from Hungary, and in Hungary there was only one training center where I could go and do this exam. And it's not really common in Hungary to have this exam. So I remember I was like the first one who passed the CS3 exam in Hungary for Photoshop, and and because it just came out that time, and I prepared a lot for the exam. I will also talk about how to prepare for the exam in more detail later, but I prepared a lot, and I remember after I passed the exam, it helped me to feel more confident as well. So it's not only to make your CV better, but you also feel confident because you passed a really difficult exam. It's not difficult because they ask questions about design, but they ask questions about everything, all the small little things in Photoshop you have to know about, and so you have to be very prepared. But once you pass the exam, you can feel confident in using Photoshop. So wherever you go for an interview, a job interview, and they ask, "Are you good in using Photoshop?" You can always say, "Yes, I'm good." And if they are interested in your design skills, that's why you have your portfolio. So you have to have a good portfolio, and on the side, if you have this exam, the exam proves that your techniques or technical skills with the application is also matching your portfolio.
So what you're saying is that Adobe certification isn't required to be a designer, but it's a very nice booster to your resume. Um,
Definitely.
but it's the most important thing. Do you think it's more important to have a good portfolio, or do you think it's also real important to have that certification?
I would say it's more important to have a good portfolio. If I would be the head of a company, a design company, I would first look for the portfolio. And if the portfolio is great, I don't need anything else. But if I need to choose between two designers, and both of them are great in design, but one of them has the exam, I would probably choose that person because if someone has the exam, that proves that they're not only good in design, but they know most of the keyboard shortcuts, they know all the little tricks and things that most self-taught designers won't even touch in Photoshop, these little time savers that can make someone more efficient. And that's something I think is the most important thing in the whole certification, that if you can pass the exam, you are a really efficient user. Okay, so you can be a great designer, but you might be slow in doing specific things. You can be really fast in doing the things that you usually do, but let's say you are in a design agency and there's something that you need to solve that you never did before. If your Photoshop skills are great, you will be really fast to solve something completely new. If you are used to doing just always the same thing, and you don't know how to do a specific thing, then it might take you hours to solve it. And that's something that a design agency won't really appreciate if you are slow in things and you're fast in other things. So that's the main or the whole idea behind the certification, to make it prove that you are efficient with using Photoshop, no matter what the task is.
I think a lot of our readers might be wondering what type of questions they could expect to see on the exam. And I was wondering if you might be able to sort of walk us through, a handful of questions that someone might possibly see on the exam.
Yeah, that is also a good question. And at this time, I would also mention that if anyone goes to the Adobe website, under Learning, there are tabs on the top of the website at this moment. So you can go to Learning and then Certifications, and you can find lots of information, but it's quite difficult to get an idea how this whole exams work. But you can also download, and probably we can include a link for this interview for the Photoshop exam. So you can download a couple of questions from Adobe's website for the exam. And there you can see also listed the topics. It's a PDF. And in the PDF, you can see the topics. So these topics are working with selections, working with layers, using masks and channels, working with type and vector tools, adjusting and processing photographs, retouching and manipulating images, working with camera raw, painting and filtering an image, working in Photoshop, that's like in general, and outputting for print and web. So these are the main topics in the Photoshop exam. And you have 64 questions at the moment, and the pass rate, the minimum required percentage is 74. It's quite high. And I prepared a couple of questions. In that PDF, you can also find a couple of samples, sample questions. But I prepared 5 questions for you, just to see what is the level usually in an exam that you need to reach. So the first question, can I start with the first question, Grant?
Go ahead.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so the first question is, what can you change for multiple selected layers? So let's say you have a Photoshop document, you have a couple of layers, and you select more than one layers at the same time, and you would like to change something with these layers. And here are the 4 options. So in the exam, you also have to always choose from 4 or 5 options. A, only opacity. B, only blend modes. C, both of them. Or D, none of them. And this question and all the other questions that I prepared are for CS5. And there are always differences between the versions, but obviously, when you do the exam, it's always the latest version of the application. So in this case, it's CS5. So the question was again, what can you change for multiple selected layers? And if you say only opacity, then you're correct. You can easily test this when you have Photoshop open. You can always try to select more layers and then see what can you do. This feature to change the opacity for multiple layers were introduced in CS5, and it's really handy because when you have like hundreds of layers and you want to select more, now in CS5 you can easily change the opacity together, so you don't have to do it one by one. And at this point, with this first question, I would like to also tell you that most of the times they Adobe prefers to ask about new features. So if you don't know the latest version well enough and you don't know the new features, you can be really good in Photoshop, but probably you won't be able to pass. So you have to be up to date and know most of the new features, even if you don't use them. Uh, it's always useful to know about them, and obviously you need them to be able to pass the exam. So that was the first question. What would you say, Grant? Would you be able to tell that it's opacity?
Well, I actually don't run CS5 on my machine, so
Ah,
um,
okay.
um, but off the top of my head, I was going to say D, none, and
Mm.
I think is that
That's correct for CS4 and all the previous versions.
okay?
That would
Well,
be correct for previous versions. Yeah.
then I don't feel dumb, so that's
Yeah. You're good. You're good. Okay. Can we go to the next one?
we can.
Cool. Second question. Which keyboard shortcut lets you use the free transform tool in perspective mode? A, Shift, B, Alt, C, Control or Command, and D, Space. Now, all of these keyboard shortcuts are useful, and you can all use them all with the free transform tool. Um, the question is which one is for changing perspective of a selected object. Um, the correct answer, if you said Control or Command, that's the correct answer. But it's always good to, if you prepare for the exam, and yeah, by this time I wanted to, I was planning to tell about an application which is really useful if you want to prepare for the exam. It's called Exam Aids. The website, we are going to provide this website as well. It's a simulator, an application that you can download. It's also for Mac and PC. You can download and install, and it basically simulates exactly the same thing that you will experience on the exam. So it gives you 64 questions one by one, and once you're ready, it will show your percentage and whether you passed or not. But it also can help you to practice. So not just to take an exam, a test exam, but you can also practice. So you can go through like hundreds of questions. They have lots of questions for each topic, and then you can learn from the answers. So they also tell you why this one is the correct answer. So in this case, I would also tell you that like Shift is also a keyboard shortcut that you can use with free transform tool. It is to resize something in proportions. Alt, Grant, what would you say? Alt, what can you do with Alt when you use the free transform tool and resizing something? You hold down Alt. Do you
Alt,
know?
alt allows you to grab one corner. Is that correct? It allows you to just to grab one of the control points and pull it out, so it sort of allows you to distort. Is that correct?
That is the control. That is the
That's
perspective.
okay.
That is the perspective. Alt is when Alt you can use to Alt, the keyboard shortcut you can use for two different things. You can change the center of the free transform tool, but mainly you can use it to resize something from the center.
From the center. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. That's it.
Now, if I actually had Photoshop open, I would do that
Yes.
automatically. But when I
That's a really good thing that you say that, because most of the users will feel that they would know the answer if they have Photoshop open, but in the exam, when you do the exam, you won't have Photoshop. So you will just see the question and the answers, and you have to know it by heart. So you need to remember everything that you usually do. And it's especially difficult for people who learned Photoshop like 10 years ago and are really used to using all these keyboard shortcuts, because for them these are routines and they might not remember when it's just like the questions there and they don't see Photoshop. So it's a really, really important thing that you need to prepare for a blank page with only the questions and the answers, and you need to remember. So sometimes there are questions in the exam when they show you a screen capture or a screenshot, and then it helps you to see what are they talking about. For example, like the masks panel, and then they refer to something specific. Then they show you a screenshot. But most of the times it's just the questions and the answers. So you need to basically you need to memorize lots of things in Photoshop where you can find options and features. And like keyboard shortcuts are really, really important in the exam. They always ask from 64, I would say definitely 20 questions are related to keyboard shortcuts in some level.
So,
Okay.
so everyone learn your shortcuts.
Yes. Learn them well.
And I
Okay.
actually think you did you wrote an article on our site a while back about keyboard shortcuts, and it probably would be a good place to start.
Definitely.
Although my guess is that it probably wouldn't ensure that you would pass the test.
No, no, and it doesn't cover all the keyboard shortcut. It covers my favorite, I think 20 or 25 favorite keyboard shortcuts,
Hmm.
but most of them are CS5 specific, or there are a couple of CS5 specific keyboard shortcut which they most likely to ask in the exam. So that's a good idea to start there and learn those keyboard shortcut first. Cool. The third question is, what is the use of the fill opacity? So in the layers panel, we have the fill opacity, and that's the question, what is the use of that? A, it can change the visibility of the layer effects or layer styles. B, it can change the visibility of the layer without affecting the layer styles. C, it only works with fill layers. D, it does the same thing as the opacity, if you change the opacity. Okay, so if you never use the fill layer or the fill opacity option, and you are at the exam and you have to find out, this is also another thing which I recommend, you should always try to find the answer which makes sense. So in this case, it might be difficult because most of the answers are close to they are most of them are nearly correct. But Grant, what would you say from these answers? Do you know? Have you
B,
used field opacity? It's not
B.
a problem if you haven't, because it's a quite specific thing in Photoshop.
My answer would be B. It can change the visibility of the layer without affecting the layer styles, and that would be my final answer.
Good. That's good. That's the correct answer. Really good. Yeah. It can. Some of the questions can feel, if you use, for example, fill opacity, most of the time it can feel like, oh, this is a really simple question. But once again, this is something that, because I'm teaching, I have been teaching Photoshop for years, and I know that most of the users, self-taught users, skip fill opacity. They don't really bother using it, and they don't really know how to use it. They always just use opacity. But in the exam, in the Adobe exam, they prefer to ask questions about the less used features. So they won't ask you questions about the opacity, they will ask you questions about the fill opacity. And for example, if they won't ask you questions from, let's say there is a panel, they won't ask you questions about the most commonly used button from that panel. They will probably ask something from the panel menu, like panel options, and from there something, whether an option is useful for this or that. So you have to dig deeper in the application, not just prepare for the most commonly used options. They prefer to ask questions about the less uh, how do you call this? So the things
Le-
that you,
Less
yeah,
used features.
less used, yeah, less used features, but still useful. Like fill opacity, if you know how to use it, you will probably use it all the time. but you have to learn how does it work. So for example, I remember when I was teaching Photoshop and someone asked me, why is it so difficult to do in Photoshop a circle with a white line around it, but without a fill? Because in Illustrator, it's really simple. You have the fill and the stroke around it. But in Photoshop, you don't really have an option for that. And in that case, I would say the easiest way is to have a circle, just draw a circle with a shape layer, for example, and use a stroke around it with the layer style, and then just set the fill opacity to 0%, which means you won't have a fill, you will just see the stroke around the object. So really simple and basic, but there's so many things in Photoshop that they can easily find something that you might never use before. So that's why it's good to prepare for the exam, even if you are really good in Photoshop. Okay. Can we go to the next question?
Absolutely.
Okay. I have 2 more questions left. What is the best way to save different versions of a composition into the same PSD file? A, using layer groups. B, creating layer comps. C, using smart objects. D, working non-destructively. Okay. What would you say, Grant? I'm sorry to ask you, but
No,
you're the only one here.
yeah, no, it's okay. Everyone can see how much or little that the Psdtuts editor knows about Photoshop. Now, I would say if I'm not exactly sure I fully understand the question, but from what I understand of the question, I would say B, create layer comps. Is that it? Yeah. Yeah. This is why I'm so bad at multiple choice. I'm terrible because I never understand the question. And even it could be written out super simple, but I always think of 1,000 different ways to interpret it. So I always get multiple choice questions wrong. But
You're not alone. You are not alone with that, and I can tell that in the Adobe exam, sometimes they phrase the questions so difficult in a difficult way. So the way I phrase them is, I think they are quite easy to understand. But sometimes in the Adobe exam, I'm not sure, but I think they might even want you to be tricked by the way they ask a question. So you have to be very careful. You have to always read it at least 2 or 3 times before you choose an answer. So it's good that you said this, that it's hard to understand the question. So always make sure that you spend enough time. I think you have 1.5 hours to answer 64 questions, which should give you more than a minute for each question. So you definitely have time to read it properly. And I honestly suggest to read it at least 2 or 3 times before you choose your answer, because sometimes the questions can be long and quite difficult to understand. And yet I also want to mention that in the exam, you can skip a question, so you don't have to answer it for the first time. You can flag it and come back to it once you finish the whole exam. So if you find a difficult question, you don't really understand the question, or you can't decide between a couple of answers, then you can flag it and go further, and then later on come back to it and just try to find or guess which is the correct answer. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
okay, so we ready for final question?
Yeah. Are you ready?
I don't know. I don't know.
Okay. This is a tricky one. This is quite difficult. Which filter is not available for smart objects? A, Gaussian blur. B, lens blur. C, lens correction. Or D, high pass. This is again something that you will only know if you know the filters well, and you also use smart objects most of the time, and smart objects together with filters, which means they are going to be smart filters. If you never used smart objects before, it would be really difficult to tell which is the correct answer in this case. Do you use smart objects? Grant?
I do, but to be honest, I have no idea what the
Mm.
answer is. But if I was gonna pick one, I would say C, lens correction.
Yeah, that's why no, sorry, Grant. That's the trick. It's lens blur.
Ah, it's lens
But
blur, so I got it
yeah,
wrong.
yeah, that was intentionally there, the lens correction, because I know, and this is what they do in the Adobe exams as well. They give you something that sounds very unlikely to be the correct answer, like lens correction, but it's still it's possible to use it as a smart filter. But lens blur is something that you can't use. So this is where they want you to be tricked, and they give you an answer which is misleading. So once again, you have to be prepared for all of these special questions. But out of five, you answered them four properly, which means it's 80%, so you would be able to pass.
All right, all right.
Which
Well,
is
hopefully, maybe
nice.
we can find an exam with only 5 questions.
Yeah.
Well, that was a lot of fun, and hopefully our readers will learn a little something about the Adobe exam. And one thing that they can expect is some more quizzes from you in the future. So I know you're in the process of putting together a list of questions. I know some of these questions will be on there as well. So it'd be a great way to sort of test your knowledge. And I know that when we did our quiz last month, they were very popular. So
Mm.
hopefully our readers can expect more of that sort of thing in the future. I guess my next question for you um, is sort of about what is the next step after you've received your certification. So I know that you know how do you go from sort of being someone who is just certified as an expert to someone who's an instructor or a speaker? Yeah, so maybe you could fill us in. What's the next step?
Yeah. Um, Usually when we talk about certification, it's good to know about the levels in being certified as well. So Adobe has its own system, and they call there is actually an exam before the expert exam. I'll just go back a bit in time. So there is actually another exam called the associate exam, which is easier to pass, but it's less relevant if you want to find a job as a designer. So it's good to pass or do that exam as well. But I would suggest for all readers to go for the expert level. So prepare for the expert level, and if they are new to Photoshop, they might need to spend a year of learning and doing tutorials, or half a year. It depends on the intensity. And I usually call the associates, if we refer to Star Wars, it's easier to remember these levels. Associates are like the Padawans. Experts are like the Jedis. And then you can be a master, Adobe master, if you can pass not just the Photoshop exam, but you can pass Illustrator, InDesign, and Acrobat. You will be a Adobe design master. That's like Obi-Wan Kenobi, for example. And if you want to go further, even further, then you can become an instructor. So you can teach people about all these techniques in Photoshop and the other applications as well. Now that would be a next level, and that's what I'm going to talk about. That's like Yoda, Yoda's level. It's a really interesting thing to teach, and in my experience, I've learned a lot from teaching other people, because whenever you teach, no matter who you teach, the person that you are teaching about the Photoshop techniques will also give you priceless feedback about the things that you are talking. Uh, he or she might have a completely different view, and just as an example, I once I was teaching architects for Photoshop, and they taught me a lot of useful things about perspective. Or another time, I was teaching doctors to use Photoshop for to enhance their X-ray images. It was also a really interesting presentation. And once again, I learned a lot from them about these medical images. And there are some really interesting things about medical images. And I just found out when I prepared for that presentation that in Photoshop, since I think CS4, in the extended version, you have an option for 3D medical images. So I don't know how they call it, but then it's like the scanner goes through and makes lots of images of, let's say, a bone,
Hmm.
and then you can put it together in Photoshop and you can rotate it around.
I believe it's
So
an MRI what they
yeah,
use to
that's
do.
it. That's it. That's it. So so it's always, if you want to become an instructor, all you need to do is to pass. All you need to do, it's so simple, to pass the expert exam, and you have to have some sort of teaching background. If you don't have any teaching background, you can pass a standard exam called CompTIA. It's an exam if you want to be a teacher with IT stuff, and it's like the Adobe exam, but specifically for someone who wants to become an instructor. And if you have these two exams or have some sort of training background, then you will be able to get the instructor certificate from Adobe. So you don't have to do anything else. You just need to apply for it. And if you can prove these two certificates, the expert exam and some sort of training background, then you will get the instructor certificate. And then you can be a teacher on your own. So you can be a freelance Adobe instructor, certified instructor, or you can start looking for an authorized Adobe training center where you can teach other people. And that's what I did. I was teaching in Hungary, then I came to London and I was teaching here. And if you start doing teaching, instructing, probably you will also do presentations because it's basically the same thing. And presentations are my favorite. They are really a lot of fun, especially with Photoshop because I'm doing presentations with the other Adobe products as well. But Photoshop is great because whenever I show something, and let's say there's a big crowd. Once I was presenting in front of like 1,000 people on a big Photoshop event. And when you show something really cool, let's say the content-aware field or something like that, which looks like really uh, impossible or like amazing, then the crowd goes like, "Wow!" And you feel like being a magician or something like that. And it's really fun presenting Photoshop. So once you start presenting, you can be if you're good, you can become an international speaker for Adobe, and Adobe has its own evangelists, Adobe evangelists, but you don't have to be closely working together with Adobe. You can be certified, and then you can be a freelance presenter, and and if you want to look for jobs, for example, as an instructor, it's really good that Adobe has a network of all the training companies around the world, and there are hundreds of them. So, for example, if you are planning to go to, let's say, Australia, and you are looking for Adobe instructor jobs, then you will probably find all the authorized training centers in Australia, and then you can contact them directly through this network. So that's what I did when I moved here to London, and it made it really easy for me to go abroad and work abroad. So I think that would be the next step after someone is an expert. But this is not a must. So once you are an expert, you can find a job as a designer, or you can go this other route, being an instructor. I think it's the best to do both. A bit of instructing will help you to become a better designer, and vice versa.
Now, once you become a certified expert, is there any um, training that you have to do afterwards to maintain your certificate?
Yes, there's no training. You can actually go to attend the Adobe Max. Well, obviously, you have to still pay for it. These events are really cool for everyone interested in the new Adobe technologies, and you can always learn more about Photoshop, even if you are a certified instructor and presenter. I'm still learning new things about Photoshop and new techniques. It's literally an endless learning curve. But the most important thing is that you have to recertify once a new version comes out. So
Mm.
let's say Photoshop CS6, let's say that will be the next version, comes out. Most of the times they give you like 3 or 4 months, or sometimes even 6 months before you have to recertify. So they give you time to get used to the new version and start using the new features. And after 6 months of the introduction of the new version, you have to recertify. But the recertification exam is much easier and faster than the real exam. So once you pass the main exam, the recertification will be like, I think it's around 30 or 40 questions, so less questions. And most of the time they are easier because they are only related to the new features.
Hmm.
So they are not interested in your general knowledge because you already proved that you know that. They are only interested in the new features, whether you know about the new features or not.
Is there a fee or anything to recertify?
Yeah, I think at the moment it's $100, American dollars, to recertify, and the exam itself, the ACE exam, is 250, I think, or 150. I'm not sure, but it's always changing, and it's best to look at the Adobe's website to always see the up to date information.
So they get you on the new version, and then they get you on the certification exam, then they get you on the recertification.
Yeah,
Well, well,
exactly. But
well, what
but
could you do? They got to
yeah,
make money. They've got to make money too, you know.
yeah, yeah. But if you, the good thing is being an instructor at a training center is usually the training center will pay for your recertification. So that's what I did for the last, I think the last time when I paid for the exam was CS2 when I took it. And since then it was always the training center paying my recertification, which is good.
Well, Martin, I think I've probably taken up enough of your time today. Just one final question. Do you have any final thoughts or anything to add to for our readers?
Just a small thing. I really appreciate all the feedback that I get from the tutorials that I publish. It's great to see that it's useful while I'm recording, and I really enjoy doing them. They are really hard work to record these tutorials, but I'm happy. I'm glad to see the great feedback, and I hope everyone enjoys this new digital art series. I'm still working on it at the moment.
Well,
Once we finish this interview, I will finish also a tutorial.
I think I can speak for our readers when I say how much that we appreciate the effort that you've put into those series, and I know how much the readers have enjoyed it because, I mean, you can read the comments, you know, on each of those tutorials, and you can see the ratings that they give them too. They're always, you know, 4 to 5 stars. So I think you've done an excellent job with the Photoshop Basics series, and I think you are doing an excellent job with the digital art series. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Grant. Thank you. It's a lot of fun.
Well, I've actually enjoyed watching them, and so you know
Cool.
when you email them to me, if I, you know, the first thing I do is watch them, you know, and so I'm like, wow, that's awesome. How do you do that, you know? So I'm learning things too as I'm watching these videos too, and I'm lucky enough to see them, you know, uh,
Earlier.
you know, a couple months in advance before everyone else. So I'm always excited about it, uh, but anyways, Martin, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, and hopefully we'll get to chat again soon.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Grant. Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Yes, it's evening here in London.
And I'm gonna
Thank you.
and I'm gonna bat. I've got to batten down the hatches because we're expecting a hurricane here in New York
Oh,
City. You know,
wow.
yeah, I don't understand that. I moved to New York and you know, to experience a hurricane. You know, if I feel like if I'm gonna experience a
Not really.
hurricane, I should at least be able to like experience, you know, sunny beach weather. You know, an ocean. No, I'm in New York. Well, you know what the heck. So hopefully by the
There's a
time,
hurricane for you.
yeah, hopefully by the time everyone sees this video that I'm still okay. But
Yeah, take care. Take care.
all right, see you, Martin.
See you, Grant.